Good evening, everyone. My name is Julianne Phillips, the Director of Voter Services for the League of Women Voters Grosse Pointe, serving the Grosse Pointes and Harper Woods. The League of Women Voters encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government, works to increase the understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. The League is strictly nonpartisan, neither endorsing candidates nor supporting political parties. The League of Women Voters Grosse Pointe, in both its values and its practices, reaffirms its commitment to diversity. Membership is open to men and women ages 16 and older. Tonight's presentation is The Attack on DEI, What We All Stand to Lose. This is the latest in our democracy series. We are delighted to have Jay Kaplan as our speaker tonight. Jay is a staff attorney for the ACLU of Michigan, which stands for the American Civil Liberties Union. He is at the forefront of legal efforts to ensure the civil rights of LGBTQ plus people are protected and expanded. Jay is also a frequent speaker on college campuses and a panelist at Civil Rights Forum. Jay was honored with the 2006 Unsung Hero Award from the Michigan State Bar and the 2010 Virginia Worry Bay Civil Rights Awards from the National Education Association. Before I hand the presentation over to Jay, I have some brief Zoom reminders. Please remember to put your audio on mute. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. If you are uncomfortable with the chat, please raise your hand. After Jay's presentation, we will proceed with the questions from the chat and on screen. My colleague Judy will monitor the chat. If there are any unanswered questions throughout this presentation, we will get back to you. We have all the attendees' email addresses in the registration link. And also, please note, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted on the League's YouTube channel. Jay, the Zoom room is yours.
Thanks so much, Julianne. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. And these are some very interesting times, to say the very least. There's so much going on right now, and attacks on many principles and ideas and ethics and values that many of us hold near and dear to our hearts, and that we think that are important. And clearly, in the area of DEI, we're seeing this full-prong attack by the current administration against having programs. And DEI, by the way, stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I thought what we might first want to talk about is, what is the purpose of a DEI program? What is the impetus for programs like this? What are the benefits of it? And then talk about what's happened in terms of a backlash to diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, one thing that I've learned from my work with the LGBTQ plus rights project is that for all the progress that you can make in an area of civil rights and moving the needle forward, you can also expect a significant pushback and sometimes a backlash to that progress that's being made. And I think what we're seeing in terms of the Trump administration and executive orders that have been issued are symptomatic of some of this organized backlash to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the principle behind diversity, equity, inclusion is the idea that we are a multicultural society, we are a diverse population, and that workplace and programs should reflect that diversity, that we should see the faces of our community, and that for many years there are communities that have been marginalized, that have been discriminated against, that have been purposely and illegally denied the opportunity to participate either in the job workforce or participate in different programs or to be able to access educational programs that were available to a majority group of people. And so the efforts of diversity and inclusion is to create an environment that outreaches to different communities in sense when we're talking about employment, to try to recruit people, and also a place that provides the support and the tools that are necessary for everyone to be successful at their job. I mean, we all come from different backgrounds. We all have different life experiences. And I don't think one can ever expect that everyone is the same in terms of when we talk about the workforce and their approach to work, or in terms how necessarily what they can offer and contribute to a job or to a program. And so the purpose behind DEI is to recognize that diversity. And studies show that when you have a diverse workforce, when you have a college campus that reflects a diverse community, you are sharing different ideas and different perspectives, and it improves the overall environment for everyone. And uh, uh, and a place that values diversity creates a safer and supportive environment for everyone who's involved. So those are all the benefits. And we saw a particular movement in terms of businesses, actively forming diversity, equity, inclusion committees and developing programming in many ways in 2020 as a result of the George Floyd, his death at the hands of police officers. People saying, now is the time. Now is the time to reflect on what are some lessons that we can learn from this. If we have a better understanding of everybody and where we're coming from, we might be able to create a better society and a more effective society. But of course, anytime you make progress in this area, and a lot of innovative programs have been developed. I know, I can even speak from my own perspective working at the ACLU of Michigan. This year I'll be there 24 years. And when I started out, it was a small organization. I think we had 6 full-time employees. But for several years, it was basically white cisgender employees there that had been there around for a long time. And then our organization itself decided that they needed to actively focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and to do broader outreach when there were job openings and opportunities to create a more diverse workforce. And I can say, from experience, how much that has benefited the ACLU of Michigan, the work that we do, the issues that we consider, the perspective that we have. There's still certainly more work to be done, but I think that certainly has improved and strengthened our organization to the fact that today we have about 40 employees working, and we have 3 offices in the state of Michigan. We have our Detroit office, we have an office in Grand Rapids, as well as a Lansing office. So I talked to you, about the pushback anytime you make progress on civil rights. And there were certain individuals and organizations and political groups that decided they didn't like this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion. And so they attempted to create a narrative about diversity and equity and inclusion that is at odds with what a program actually is. And yet it took hold with a lot of different people. In other words, they viewed diversity, equity, inclusion as some kind of a quota program. In other words, by having a diverse work environment or diverse programs and perspectives, that somehow you were excluding other people. And when I say other people, we're talking about white people, white males, and to some extent white females. That somehow by valuing diversity, you were excluding white people, and that by virtue of having a program where you reach out to different communities and you want to provide support for people to do well in their jobs with depending on what they need, and that applies to all employees. But somehow that these hires, somehow these people that are involved in these programs were less than. In other words, they weren't qualified for the position. They weren't qualified to participate in a program or to get into any school, that they were inferior to the so-called majority. And once again, we're talking about the white majority, and their presence is only reflective of a DEI program, and that somehow they harm programs by their very own presence, by these efforts that were being made. And then when we look into the area of, in terms of educational programs, we saw this narrative that by talking about, in terms of teaching about our country's history, including teaching about our country's history regarding race relations and the sad history of slavery and, of course, racism throughout the centuries, that somehow by doing this, we were making white people feel bad. That by talking about this issue, this was painting all white people as bad, and this was harming students, who are hearing about this thing. And so we can't have a discussion of, what was termed as critical race theory, and that we can't have certain representations of diversity in our school curriculum, because somehow by talking about these people, these other people, we were giving short shrift to white people. I guess that's the best way that I can say that. And so, while we were seeing this attack on DEI programs, hand in hand, it was also going in terms with efforts to try to censor books, to ban books from public libraries, from school libraries. And what we saw is that the list of books, to be banned, usually they are books that focus on LGBTQ characters and situations, as well as books that deal with racial issues and racial discrimination. And so we've seen this kind of pushback. And we saw, even before these executive orders have been introduced, we've seen legislative efforts, particularly in Florida. This attack on woke, that this terminology be woke, about understanding other people and being supportive of their culture, being culturally competent and sensitive to the other communities that we interact with on a daily basis, was somehow a bad thing, somehow was a wasted thing, somehow was not a valued thing. And we saw the dismantling and the prohibition on DEI programs in various states. And we also saw that during the presidential campaign last year, the Trump campaign talked about eliminating DEI programs. And we saw in Project 2025, even though the president said he had no knowledge of this program, didn't know anybody involved with it, they clearly had a number of initiatives within the Project 2025 template to talk about dismantling and doing away with DEI programs. So here we are now in 2025, and we've seen that the Trump administration, yep. Well, I mean, I think the whole discussion about critical race theory, I'd like to go back to that, is the discussion about, the causes of racism and the effects of racism, that it was through different, political organizations who decided to say that when you discuss this, that somehow it discriminates against white people. It's meant to make white people feel bad. It's meant to exclude white people. And then you had a number of media outlets. I was reading an article today that Fox News in 1 year of their broadcast presented more than 1,000 negative stories about critical race theory, and constantly repeated that terminology as a bad thing. And we saw the same thing in terms of, with regards to attacks against transgender people, with some of these media outlets. By creating, by presenting these negative stories, you create a narrative, and people who are watching that, they have a particular perspective, and they decide that somehow this is a bad thing, and that somehow by being diverse, by valuing diversity, it harms white people. That somehow they're being excluded, they're missing out. An opportunity that should be theirs, a position that should be theirs, is being taken away because we're valuing diversity. And once again, it's this false narrative that these people aren't qualified. These people are inferior. They are taking your position because of these programs. And they shouldn't have these positions. These are positions that you should have. These are perspectives that you should have. These are a perspective, a narrative that should be yours. And you shouldn't be made to feel bad about any of the history that's happened over the years. So the Trump administration issued a flurry of executive orders with regards to DEI. Among the things that these executive orders do is, in terms of the federal government, in order to terminate all DEI offices, positions, and programs that exist in the federal government. So every federal government department, from the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Transportation, any type of DE program that was recognizing, the diversity of employees, that was providing programming. For instance, in my workplace, we have a heritage group that every month we present programming that focuses on a different group. That African American History Month, Arab American History Month, that focuses on a different cultural and different aspects. This executive order directed all the departments of the federal government to eliminate those programs. They also an executive order directed the federal government to terminate any equity-related grants or contracts that were related to any DEI efforts. They also said that anybody that has a federal contract, that has a contract with the federal government to receive funding, that they had to eliminate their DEI programming. And then the employers that have a contract with the federal government and they receive monies, if they had a DEI program, they had to get rid of their program. And then, of course, we've seen EEOs that would threaten to take away federal funding from nonprofits, from philanthropic organizations, from professional associations, and from universities and colleges that receive federal funding, as well as school districts, if they're engaging in what's termed to be diversity, equity, inclusion programs. The executive orders bluntly and blatantly state that they believe that having such programs is a form of illegal discrimination and in violation of what they believe to be civil rights laws. I want to just pause for a second because I mentioned executive orders. Let's talk about what an executive order is and what an executive order isn't. So an executive order is a policy directive from the executive branch, but it's not a law. The president is not a lawmaker. The president is not king and doesn't decide just because I've signed something, it's mandated, it's the law that everybody has to follow. It's a policy directive. It's not self-executing, meaning just signing the executive order doesn't automatically implement a policy. We have a requirement under the Administrative Procedure Act that, in order to implement an executive order, you first have to come up with particular policy steps to implement the order, and you have to allow time for the public to comment. And before, some of these executive orders can actually take effect. And what we're seeing out of this administration, a number of the executive orders, they're skipping over those steps and they're automatically saying, okay, this is what it is. You have to follow this now. We're freezing funding. We're taking away your funding without even setting forth, various policy steps, various administrative steps. The other thing about an executive order is it's subject to judicial review by the courts, because we've seen executive orders from various administrations be struck down as violating principles of the Constitution. And I think there's been more than 100 legal challenges filed against these executive orders, raising different constitutional concerns. It's Congress that appropriates funding and decides, we're going to fund this, we're going to put together a budget, and we're going to fund these various programs. Usually they decide in terms of money that comes to a particular department, but once grants are already, initiated and a contract has been signed, it's questionable whether or not the president has the ability to say, I don't like that grant, so I'm going to stop it. I'm just going to take away that funding. And I think that's some of the, the basis of the legal challenges that we're seeing. But we're also seeing, in terms of, as I mentioned before, not following the various administrative procedure acts related, that are required for the executive orders. And then we're also seeing challenges based on the First Amendment. And this pertains to, efforts to try to mandate a particular ideology with a program by saying you can't have these DEI initiatives. And where we're seeing this the most is in education, both in higher education as well as in secondary school education. Just last week, the ACLU National filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration regarding an executive order pertaining to the Defense Department. They have schools for children of military personnel on various military bases, and the executive order said we prohibit any form of DEI curricular. In other words, you can't be teaching things with regarding racism. You can't talk about, they quote, gender ideology. You can't talk about LGBTQ related issues. And so the lawsuit talks about this First Amendment. In other words, that the federal government, that the executive office can't dictate what can be taught, what can be learned, what can be discussed. That's outside of the Constitution. And that's the other thing I want to emphasize. An executive order doesn't usurp what's already in our Constitution. An executive order doesn't usurp already established federal civil rights laws. So in other words, we have federal civil rights laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, on the basis of sex, on the basis of disability, on the basis of age. There's nothing an executive order can do that takes away those civil rights laws. There's also nothing that an executive order can do that can take away case law precedent. In other words, U.S. Supreme Court decisions and decisions from federal courts that have addressed issues like discrimination in the workplace, like censorship in terms of, with schools and with books. That's already established precedent. There's nothing, the president doesn't have that authority to undo that. So even with their efforts to try to take away DEI programs, they can't, the administration cannot take away the responsibility of employers and educational programs and other programs that receive government funding to not discriminate against protected groups and groups that have been viewed to be marginalized and discriminated against in the past. They can't undo that sort of thing. The other thing that we've seen this administration do is threatening to investigate private businesses that have DEI programs. In other words, they would say, we'll investigate. We might file a lawsuit against you saying that you're somehow violating a civil rights law. In other words, reverse race discrimination. Or just discrimination based on religion. In other words, if someone, because of their particular religious beliefs, let's say it's related to LGBTQ issues or rights, or feels that their rights are being violated. And so what we've seen, and it's been very disconcerting, is we've seen a number of businesses already fold, do what's called anticipatory obedience. In other words, they've gotten rid of their DEI programs because they fear that they could be investigated. And the message that's sent to the employees and the message that it's sent, to customers. For instance, you heard about particularly in particular Target, they got rid of their DEI programs, and yet they did a lot of marketing and outreach to communities of color in terms of to cultivate patronage and customers there, and yet they've sent this message, whether intended to or not, that they're no longer going to have some of these diversity, equity, inclusion programs. And what we've seen too is their actual stock and their actual business has fallen off as a result to that. The president can't issue a law against businesses, from offering diversity and equity inclusion programs. Yes, the Department of Justice could investigate these businesses, but I highly doubt they're going to find by having a DEI program that somehow it's discriminating against some protected class, under our civil rights laws. But it's been very disconcerting. We've also seen, the attacks on colleges and universities. You saw, with Columbia University, ostensibly the administration said the purpose of that executive order was to make sure Columbia was adequately addressing incidents of anti-Semitism on the campus. But what they were doing was threatening to take away federal funding, $400 million from that university. And the university agreed to reach out an agreement, but one of the things that they had to agree to was to dismantle all their DEI programming. And so what you're seeing is not only in terms of this narrative that this is a bad thing, but also trying to force a particular ideology on different entities. And you saw recently Harvard said, no, we're not going to agree to these conditions. You're going to take away $4 billion. And this includes research grants, in terms of healthcare research and science research, but we're going to do without your money because we can't agree to this. This goes against our actual values. And once again, one of the things they wanted Harvard to do is to take away and dismantle any DEI programs. As a result of that, you then saw the Trump administration say, well, we're going to take away your IRS, your nonprofit status, and we're going to tell the IRS, and there's certain criteria that has to be met in order to remove nonprofit status, and I don't think they have it there, and I think we'll probably see some litigation over this. I went on a website. There's about 12 different lawsuits against these executive orders trying to prohibit DEI programs. And right now, the one that we've seen successful was related to the National Endowment for the Arts. In other words, the administration was requiring any grants from the NEA, there had to be a guarantee from people applying that they were not engaging in any artistic programs that supported gender ideology. In other words, anything that might have included transgender people or focused on issues related to transgender people. And a lawsuit was filed against the NEA. And then that directive that they sent out, they agreed to rescind that. But that's, the one thing to keep in mind about all this talk about the litigation is that lawsuits take a long time. Courts are not fast. Even there's been a lot of requests for what's called preliminary injunctions against these orders. In other words, it would stay the implementations of the orders while the court's reviewing the legal merits of a legal challenge. But sometimes you don't get those right away. Sometimes the courts refuse to grant them. And what it does, it allows the harm to being occurring while you're doing the legal challenges. And so it can make it very difficult. I also heard, the other day, you might have heard about this too, that Michigan State University joined 17 other colleges and universities that said, we are going to collectively work together to resist the efforts of this administration to take away our federal funding unless we get rid of our DEI programming and our efforts about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in other words, we're going to share resources, attorneys, and because we're not going to be bullied and intimidated in terms of what we can teach and what we value. And I think that's really significant. I think what's so disheartening when we've seen businesses and other entities folding is a lot of it's been out of fear. And whenever you have, efforts at authoritarianism and trying to steamroll over groups of people and to say this is what it is and this is what you can teach and this is what you can discuss, and if you don't do this, I'm going to harm you. The way that you fight back is through a group effort, and there's strength in numbers. And so when someone is able to stand up, it really makes a big difference. Now, I promised Julianne that I would stop at 8:05, and I just wanted to briefly mention, in terms of the work that I directly do, I just want to make sure people are aware that of this unprecedented, full-pronged attack against the transgender community. They estimate that transgender people make up maybe 0.5% of the country's population. And yet, in less than 3 months, this administration has issued 9 and counting executive orders attacking the transgender community, denying them the ability to get an accurate passport and federal identity documents that reflect who they are, prohibiting them from enlisting in the military, from being able to continue serving in the military. Executive order that would take away federal funding from any entity that offers gender affirming health care, even if federal monies are not used to provide this health care. An order threatening to take away federal funding from public school districts that are supportive of transgender students. In other words, recognizing their names, their pronouns, permitting them to access restrooms in accordance with their gender identity, from being able to play sports, prohibiting states from using federal dollars to support gender ideology. An executive order that prohibits federal prisons from offering gender affirming care to transgender inmates and transgender female inmates who might have been housed with the female population out of safety and security concerns were directed to be moved back into the male prison facility. The effort of these executive orders is essentially to erase existence of transgender people in all walks of life. And there are a number of legal challenges that have been brought against these executive orders. Some of them have resulted in preliminary injunctions, but it's very clear that this administration's position is not only, through the federal government to deny existence of transgender people, but also to threaten states like the state of Michigan that are doing good things, doing the right thing on behalf of transgender individuals by threatening to take away their funding, by investigating school districts, by investigating healthcare programs as an effort to try to prevent our state from doing the good things that they have been doing. And this is very disconcerting because, once again, an executive order cannot erase our state civil rights laws that we have. And in Michigan, we're one of 23 states that have explicit protections for LGBTQ people in our state civil rights laws. And what we're seeing right now is that many school districts that have good policies are afraid that they'll be under the radar of the Trump administration. And so they're debating whether or not they should get rid of their policies. At the same time, we're telling them, look, this is not a license for you to discriminate, because if you start discriminating, or if you revert to discrimination, you're in violation of our state civil rights laws. So stay tuned, for all of this. And before I, answer some of the questions, if this feels overwhelming to folks, that's the purpose. This is their tactic. They want to throw everything against the wall, all at once, the shock and awe, so people feel overwhelmed, so people feel helpless, so people feel that they're not able to concentrate on what's going on and don't know what to do. And this is a direct tactic. So people throw up their hands and say, I don't know, what am I supposed to do about that? And what we try to tell people is, no, you can't be expected to know the minutia and the details of everything, because this administration has been relentless. Every single day there's a new executive order, or several executive orders or policy changes. It's incredibly difficult to keep up with and also to ingest all that. But my advice is, figure out a few things that you really care about, keep up to date what's going on in the news, but try to focus in a lane that you've selected for yourself about what's going on. And obviously at this point in time, everybody's voice is needed. And my suggestion is to everybody, do something, say something, speak up, speak out. It means something. And, I used to poo-poo, oh, you put something on social media, big deal. You know what? With regards, to the work with transgender people, this community needs to hear support from their allies and people to know that they're seen, that they're visible, and that they're cared about. And but figure out, what can I do? Contact your legislator, contact your elected officials. This doesn't have to be. We elect, our government, and these people are paid by our taxpayer money. And if they're afraid of this administration, or they're afraid of not getting reelected, that's not why we elected them to be leaders. So just so they can be poised to continue to be reelected, they have to stand for something.
Right.
and they have to stand for our own interests. So that's incredibly important. And if you're able, participate in, these rallies and these
Right.
events. But
Absolutely.
make your voice heard now
Thank you.
more than ever, because collectively we do have this power. And I think another tactic of this administration is for people to be afraid, to be fearful, and to fold, to equivocate, to go along with. Um, and I think the more people who, I heard today a particular senator said, we're afraid. We're afraid that if we speak out against the administration, we will receive retribution. Well, okay, that's probably a reality. But if collectively people said, no, we're not going to do this, it's going to be hard to the retribution and to retaliate against everybody when you need their votes, for the initiatives that you're trying to do. So I'm going to stop talking, as I promised. I
Okay.
went 2 minutes over, Julianne. I'm sorry.
That is okay. That is okay.
And I
So
want to go.
passionate, Jay. Thank you so much for that very engaging presentation.
Thank you.
And it's
Thank you so much.
time now for our question and answer period. And I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful tech support person, Judy Florian, to see if she can. How many questions did we get, Judy? Did we get a lot?
We have quite a few questions
Okay.
today. Okay, get ready.
Sure.
I know you talked a little bit about critical race theory. I'm going to repeat this question from Wilhelmina because I think you might have covered it, but I want to make sure. Please briefly describe how critical race theory morphed into racial discrimination against white people and woke. It's my understanding that critical race theory was mainly a lecture or course in law schools, not general education.
Right, right. I think what you saw is the opposition. They decided this is an opening. Let's create a narrative, albeit a false one, about what this is. And let's try to paint it with a broad brush that anytime you talk about issues related to race, and let's face it, our country has had and continues to have an unfortunate history and reputation regarding racism, that anytime you address that issue, that somehow you are engaging in reverse discrimination. And it was amplified by various media outlets on social media and in some of the television stations. And I look at that and I find it very similar to in terms of the transgender issue. In other words, there's a lot of things that the general public thinks about being transgender. In other words, just an example of a false narrative. Transgender youth gender affirming care does not include surgery. If you're under age 18, there's no surgical procedure that you're eligible or that you can get. And yet we see this narrative. I don't like the idea of these kids getting surgery, before they can figure things out. That's not true. And we've seen this narrative about sports automatically, that any transgender girl has an unfair competitive advantage against a cisgender female athlete. And that's not the case, and that hasn't been borne out in studies. But once again, our society in general has allowed these particular groups of people to co-opt and to take over that narrative. And what we have to do is we have to reclaim that, and we have to explain. It's very difficult. It's because, we know there are certain outlets where you can actually receive the truth about what's going on, but there are many outlets where people get their information, particularly from social media, where a lot of the information is false and it is disinformation, and that's what people know. So.
Thanks, Jay. Okay, if money has already been allocated or authorized to a department, how can the administration cut these funds? It appears that all employees are fired, so there's only a shell of department left in some of these areas. I don't know if you could address that.
Well, we do know that the spending power and appropriation does rest with Congress. And if Congress wants to, take action and make it clear, we appropriate the funds and things that we've already committed. You can't try to take that away by making cuts and things to programs that have already been allocated. And that's part of the constitutional challenges to some of these actions. And when we didn't raise the issue of DOGE, but, cutting these departments and getting rid of programming where funding was already committed for that raises those constitutional issues. Now, on the other side of the coin, Congress appropriates a budget and says, okay, Department of Health and Human Services, you're getting so many $1 billion for your programming, but the decisions in terms of how you're going to fund programs and what you're going to do with those programs, that remains with the department. In other words, they decide we're going to set up some grants and we're going to pay out grants. So under this administration, they can now move forward, with a budget for next year, and they can say, you know what, no more grants for research on HIV, no more grants for research, with regarding racial disparities in healthcare. They have that authority to do so. But you're absolutely right in terms of funds that have already been committed and appropriated. The idea about taking those funds away or freezing those funds that are already committed, they raise serious constitutional issues. And if you notice, Congress has not passed anything. Right? I'm not aware of any laws. It's all through these executive orders. It's almost that, well, I mean, I think the reality is you're not seeing much in terms of a legislative branch and in terms of doing much in the way of anything other than approving, appointments to the administration, but they're not initiating very much of legislation at all, except, these foregoing this budget thing that will include, various, tax cuts for certain populations. But there is Congress can say, look, this is our authority and you can't take that away. And they could sue over it, but they have not done so.
Okay, what recourse is there when the administration ignores court orders?
Yeah, good question. We're at a really serious point in terms of our democracy and whether things take hold. As we are a system of checks and balances. And as I mentioned to you before, we really aren't seeing much in the way of legislative checks and balances. Senator Murkowski saying we're afraid to speak up, we're afraid to challenge. We're seeing that this administration pretty much can do whatever it wants to do without any pushback from the legislative branch. So we have to rely on our courts to do this. And we're at a very precarious point because we're seeing this administration refusing to follow. For instance, in the matter of Kilmar Obrego Garcia, where it was very clear, the court said you must facilitate his release. You have admitted that you mistakenly sent him to this horrible prison in El Salvador wrongfully, and you will not, we ordered you to bring him back and you're not doing so. I think eventually this will go up to the Supreme Court. It will go back to the Supreme Court, which was a little timid with their previous orders saying, you have to make efforts to facilitate, which the Trump administration read as, well, we just have to take steps. We don't necessarily have to bring this person back. But I really think it's going to be up to the Supreme Court, because if this administration refuses to follow court orders, pretty much ignores the legislature, we got to ask ourselves, do we really have a democracy? And that's really at stake. You've seen other presidential administrations ideologically, at odds with what the courts have decided, and yet they respected the rule of law. During the President Nixon's administration, when the Supreme Court said, you must turn over those tapes, the buck stops here. We made this decision. And that's when, they did. And the president decided to resign because knew that because of the result of this decision and having to do so, it would prove, it would indicate malfeasance on his part in terms of the Watergate break-in and his knowledge about that. But this idea that there's there's a standoff, I don't know. We've never been in this kind of situation before. And I hope that this U.S. Supreme Court will do the right thing. They've done some pretty outrageous things, in my opinion, in the past several years with the reversal of Roe v. Wade without demonstrating any change in legal precedent. And the decision they issued last year, basically saying that a president can't be criminally charged for any type of activity they do while they're president in office. And I do believe that sent a message to this administration that I'm basically all powerful and I can basically do anything that I want. I will hope that if it does go up to the Supreme Court, the executive branch will blink and they will comply with this order. I can't understand why they wouldn't comply with something like that when they admitted that mistakenly this person was sent here. But, you know, we have a lot of things we have to question. Is this what our country's all about? Can you just pick up somebody off the street without any due process and send them to a prison or to a detention facility? Without having even charged them with anything and been able to prove that they violated anything related to our laws. And if we can't get that relief from our courts, I mean, how does a court, if the administration refuses to follow, what can the court do? They can't arrest the president, right? Because he can't be criminally charged. They don't have marshals that can come and arrest administrative officials. They can, I guess they could try to fine the administration, but is that really going to have any effect? So I think if in that horrible worst case scenario, it's going to be up to all of us. If people are okay with this and they're not willing to say something or do something, then I guess there might be some people that are okay with the idea of our no longer having democracy as we know this. But if we raise our voices and we demand that our if our courts are ineffectual or not being followed, then we have to demand that our elected leaders do something, that they handle their responsibility in terms of checks and balances. And the heat has to go on some of those people that have been supportive of this administration, and they have to know what are the electoral and the political consequences of continuing to go along with this. So we're just going to have to see. This is never, I'm not aware of this ever happening before in our country's history, where the executive branch has seemed to say we don't have to follow what a court says.
Jay, you mentioned several lawsuits have been filed specifically against the DEI. The question is, does a lawsuit delay the implementation of an executive order?
If a temporary restraining order can be issued or preliminary injunction can be issued, yes, it can. And so the purposes of all of these lawsuits is to try to slow things down as much as possible to alleviate the harm. But as I mentioned before, you don't always get a preliminary injunction right off the bat. So as an example of the passport, the trend, and I'm going aside from the DEI thing, but as far as with the transgender passport policy, it was implemented right away. And so transgender people no longer can have, unless if they're getting a new passport or if they need to amend their passport, they're going to have this document that doesn't match what their state ID says or what their birth certificate says. So when they travel abroad, they could be stopped by officials in, another country. Why don't you look like what it says who you are on your passport? They're encountering difficulties and inconveniences and being outed right now. Now, there's been a request for a preliminary injunction, but there was a hearing on March 25th. It's April 17th, the court is yet to issue an order. And then what can also happen, Judy, is, the Trump administration often appeals these preliminary injunctions and they ask the next higher court to lift, these injunctions. And we've seen in the past, sometimes the United States Supreme Court has lifted a nationwide injunction against the continued enforcement of these executive orders while the matter is pending before the court. So, but you're absolutely right. The goal is, we might not get a decision saying, no, you absolutely can't do this. It's permanently enjoined by the highest court of the land. But if we can slow things down and prevent the harm from actually taking effect. And of course, a lot of these executive orders create a great deal of uncertainty for people in their lives. I'm going to give another example of the transgender community, the transgender military ban. There's a nationwide injunction against this, but you have many people who are actively serving in the military with that uncertainty. Could I be fired tomorrow? If that injunction is, what am I going to do? I was talking to a gentleman 2 days ago who has served, in the Navy JAC for the past 6 years. He's a commissioned officer, and he felt like he had to leave, even though there's currently an injunction, because he can't rely. This is his income. This is his livelihood. This is how he takes care of his family. And, a court decision could change all those things overnight. So what do you do in your lives? And I think the same thing holds true. You're hearing about people who, because grants have been canceled and research projects have been canceled and money's been taken away, people's livelihood, their jobs and the things that they do can be overturned, can be taken away from them just overnight. And so, yes, you want to try to stop these things from happening, but it sometimes doesn't happen in the timeliness that you need it to happen. And sometimes those injunctions, temporary, preliminary injunctions can be lifted by the courts. So, for instance, you heard today the United States Supreme Court is going to take up the principle that if you're born in the United States, you're automatically considered to be a citizen. And there was the lower court's issue because the administration is trying to take away that principle that's pretty much guaranteed in the Constitution. They're trying to say that no longer applies. And so the lower courts issued a stay saying you can't enforce this interpretation while the matter's pending. And so the Trump administration has said, Supreme Court, take up this case. And while you're taking up, lift this stay. So we can say to legal citizens here who might be children of immigrant parents, you're no longer a citizen. We can deport you. We can send you back. And I believe that the court did not, grant this lifting of the stay today by granting, that they're going to hear this case. So, I think probably I'll figure out what I'm saying is certainly filing lawsuits is a way to fight back, but it will not take care of everything that's going on here. It will not be able to alleviate the harm that's been done to people, that's been done, based on policies, harm that's done to our country itself. And not all these legal challenges will be successful because we know that in the previous, in his previous administration, President Trump was able to appoint probably the largest number of judges to the Federal Court of Appeals, which is the second highest level of our courts underneath the United States Supreme Court. And many of those appointees were ideologically driven. And so we're not going to be successful. And sometimes you hear about, we've heard about decisions, unfavorable decisions, and many times it happens to be a judge that was appointed during the previous Trump administration. So.
Hey, Jay, I have quite a few more questions here, so we need to move along. Okay. We know that social media, including Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, intentionally allows and actually helps push disinformation to get more exposure or eyeballs for advertising revenue. What laws can be used to combat these outlets?
Well, yeah, and the ACLU, we're all about freedom of speech, and so we are reluctant to say, social media, you're required by law to have to take certain steps in terms to correct false information. You should do that. We encourage people to do that, but the idea that the government requiring that you have to make a statement, or you have to prohibit that kind of speech. We always believe that the answer to hate speech is more speech as opposed to censoring people's speech. But, Facebook is a commercial entity. And I think what we've seen is a number of people leaving Facebook to go to other social media platforms in response to their policies. What can we do? It is difficult. We live in the day of the internet, and there's so many platforms where people get their information and from various sources and a lot of wrong information. But I don't know how we can prevent that sort of thing. All we can do is to keep amplifying the true information and to emphasize those facts. But I don't know if there's any way we can prevent people from getting the stuff that they get.
Thank you. Are you aware of any other, we know that these are unusual times, but are you aware of any other administration that has had used executive orders without following proper procedures?
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert on this area or a historian of this, but I think I think what we've seen demonstrated from this administration that in many instances, they're not willing to, and they don't really care about following, the Administrative Procedures Acts that are required to go along with the executive orders, that they are willing to flout those rules and to, just to go ahead and doing what they're doing. Now, that's not to say they have implemented, some proposed rules and things regarding some of their executive orders, but other ones they haven't done so.
Okay. Does anyone who didn't want to put a question in the chat but wants to ask a question have any? You just raise your hand and I'll try and find you and call on you. Okay.
Yeah, one thing that I just wanted to say, I wanted to thank all of you for the work that you do and that your organization does. You do work to get accurate information out to potential voters so they can understand the positions of the candidates and hopefully to make an informed decision when they go to the ballot box. And I know also you've been very supportive of efforts in our state to make elections and voting to be more accessible for people. And I think that, we were able to pass successfully a ballot initiative in 2018 as well as in 2022 that allows more people to participate in our electoral system, which I think is so important for democracy. And I think as a result of those changes in Michigan, we've seen more progressive policies, and we've been able, just back when I started at the ACLU for this LGBTQ project, I was told by the folks at the National ACLU, oh, poor Jay, you're in a lost state. Look at what your legislature is. Look at who your governor is. This was back in 2001. Look, you're not going to get anywhere. But because of elections, we've been able to elect people who are supportive of, various civil liberties issues and have been supportive of civil rights for LGBTQ people. And that's the way that we were able to make some progress because of making sure that everybody has an opportunity who's eligible to vote. Looks like Dawn had a question.
Dawn?
Yeah, thank you. It's not so much a question as I just want to say, Jay, huge fan of the ACLU. I've been supporting you for several years. I really want to thank you for your work. And I always, if somebody says, what can I do? If they're timid to call or to go to a big thing, I say, use your dollars and support the ACLU because they are doing very good work. So I just wanted to tell you that, there's a lot of us out here that are really big believers of yours. And thank you for all the work you're doing.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And, somebody belonging or having a membership or who has the resources to support our work, we don't charge for our representation. The case where, I told you there's 40 staff, we're talking 8 attorneys, covering the whole state. And, one of the issues that National is facing, we haven't faced this so much yet, is with these law firms, caving into demands of the Trump administration and agreeing, not to do this kind of work and agreeing to do pro bono work on behalf of the administration. We're finding we work a lot with cooperating attorneys, including law firms, on the cases. We do what's called impact litigation, and our ability, the capacity, the resources is becoming somewhat limited based on what's happening at the national level with some of these law firms. Signing these agreements with the administration.
Scary. Well, thank you.
Julianne, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Well, looking at our time, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our wonderful presentation tonight. I want to personally thank our speaker, Jay Kaplan. Wow. You really shared a lot of good information with our audience tonight. Thank you very much. I also want to thank and acknowledge the members of the DEI committee of the League of Women Voters Grosse Pointe for their assistance in making this presentation happen. It was Kathy McAdams, the chair, director of the DEI committee. Martha Hudding is a member. Wilhelmina Gilbert is a member. Marge Fulno is a member. Judy Florian, our technical coordinator. Thank you so much, Judy, for monitoring those questions. Really appreciate it. And a special thank you goes to Dawn Drost, our vice president of programs, for an excellent job in promoting this presentation. Thank you, Dawn, so much. Before I let you go, I'd like to invite you to our next program. On May the 13th, it's We the People, Civics in Action, which will be held at the Grosse Pointe Woods Library at 6:45 p.m. We hope to see you there. Good night, everybody, and thank you for attending tonight.